These videos were created for you to watch along. They'll teach you about client tracks so you know what's going on. So best of luck with all of your data. Now here's your HMIS system administrator. Hello and welcome to the LSA end user training for Georgia HMIS users. In this video, we're going to be covering a few things about the LSA report as it relates to end users, including a brief overview of just exactly what is the LSA report. We're going to look at the specific data that the LSA report is looking at in the system, and then maybe most importantly, how you as an end user, as an agency, can prepare for the LSA. So let's go ahead and dive into the LSA overview. So this is a brand new report from HUD, and when I say brand new, I mean brand new. As of the making of this video, it's actually not even in HMIS yet, but the date for it to be in the system by HUD is November 1st, 2018. And we don't know a official date yet for the deadline for this report to be submitted yet, but we assume that it's definitely going to be before the end of the year. So all we know right now is November 1st, 2018 is when this report will become available, and it will be available for COC admins. The LSA stands for Longitudinal System Analysis. And this is one example where I'm very thankful for acronyms so that I never have to say that again. So I will refer to this report for the rest of this video as just the LSA. But as I mentioned, system analysis, this is a report that is looking at data from a system-wide perspective. So if you are used to reports like the APR, where it just looks at a specific project and how it's performing, this is definitely not that. If you're familiar with system performance measures, it's more along the lines of that, where it is looking at a client record in the system and then looking at the different enrollments that client might have and then coming up with summary data based on that. So again, it's very much a system-wide perspective report. And this will be submitted each year going forward by your COC admin for your local COC. So this is not a report that you will have access to in the system ever. It's not a report you have to worry about as far as the submission process. You do come into play with the LSA, and we'll get to that later. But as far as the submission process, that will be handled by your local COC admin each year. And this replaces the AHAR report that was in HMIS previously. And so maybe you worked with your COC admin each year in correcting some data quality issues that they came across as they were gathering AHAR data. That report is no longer being used, and this is where the LSA is coming and replacing that. And this is a very important report. This is what's used to generate a lot of the national homeless data. So we really want to make sure that we have the most accurate data in the system for this report to pull from, because again, this is where a lot of national homeless data that we have in the United States comes from. It comes from the data that's pulled from the LSA, as previously it was pulled from data that was pulled on the AHAR. So again, a very important report. So now let's look at the specific data that the LSA pulls. This includes bed and unit inventory. This is information that's actually added by COC admins for your projects. So it's not anything that you key into the system, but they will be working with you in getting this information from you and then keying it into the system for each of your projects that have beds. And later on in this video, I'll actually show you the form in HMIS that they use to key this information in. And then of course, client level data. And so this includes client demographics. So when you're doing an intake, the information here is very important to this report. enrollment and exit information. And so that is going to include this screen here where we, of course, select a project, have a project start date. This relationship to have household always needs to be correct. We know there should only be one self per enrollment. And then for permanent supportive housing projects and rapid rehousing projects, we know there's that housing move-in date for once this family moves into housing, and that's very important and relevant for the LSA as well. Next, we have universal data assessment information. That's the assessment that first comes up after you complete an enrollment in HMIS, and so that is covering things like disabling condition, the client location, which is what COC you're serving this client in, all of your homeless situation questions, how long has this person been homeless, where did they come from, what type of residence, what's their history of homelessness, all of that stuff here. And then finally the domestic violence assessment, which comes a little bit later in the workflow here. So this is information that the LSA is going to pull from, so it's not going to look at things like barriers that were captured on the previous screen or income. And now we'll get into the different project types and the date range that the LSA is going to pull from. So the LSA is going to pull from the following project types: emergency shelter, transitional housing, permanent supportive housing, safe haven, which we do not have any in currently in Georgia, rapid rehousing, and then finally for street outreach projects, it just looks at exit information, specifically the exit date and destination of street outreach exits. An important thing to remember with the LSA is that all it looks at is these different project types. It does not matter what the funding source for any of these is. So if you are a non-funded project, maybe you're used to reports like this not pulling information from your project or not mattering. This is not the case on the LSA. It does not matter the funding source. So if you have a project that does not receive any federal funding, it's just privately funded or whatever, if it is any of the above project types, then it's going to pull into the LSA. And so that's just important to know. If you have any projects that are set up in the system, it's any of these project types here, then the LSA is going to pull in data from those projects. And the date range it's going to pull for this year's report is going to be from 9/30/15 to 9/30/18. And so every year going forward as this report is pulled, it's actually looking back up to 3 years when it comes to the client data in the system. And so because of this, and in Georgia we had a migration a year and a half ago, it's going to be looking at a lot of data that was migrated over that might have extra data quality issues than we're normally used to dealing with. But just because this report looks back so far for this year all the way back to 9/30/15, we're going to probably have a little extra work to do to get our data in shape for this LSA report. And finally, and this is where I really want to spend some time in this video, is how can you as an agency, as an end user, how can you prepare for the submission of this LSA report? So let's go ahead and get into that. One of those ways is working with your COC admin. So because the COC admin will be the one submitting this report, but this is a report that's made up of client information from your agency's projects, then it's important that you work together with them. So as they compile data for the LSA, they might run across data quality issues that they need you to check on and fix if you can. They might need things like the bed and unit inventory, which we talked about previously. And now I actually want to show you in Client Track what those screens look like. So even though you're not the one that will be keying in the bed and unit inventory for your projects, COC admins will be doing that. I do want to show you the screens that they see so you can kind of know why they are trying to get this information from you. And so for every bed project in the system, they're going to have to fill out a record like this. And so we have inventory information date, we have inventory start date here, and this is when these beds first came available. So if this was emergency shelter that has been in operation for a couple years and they've had the same number of beds, then that the start date might be in the past. Where are these beds located, which COC? If these beds are still current, we will not do an end date here. What household types are applicable for these beds? How many beds do we actually have? How many units? For emergency shelter, you have these two questions that are required: bed type, as well as availability. And then out of these beds, how many, if any, are dedicated for veterans? How many are dedicated for youth? If this was a permanent supportive housing project, you would also have the question chronic homeless beds. So how many beds are dedicated to chronic homelessness? And then out of these beds, how many are participating in HMIS? So for these beds, any clients that go through these beds, is all this getting captured in HMIS? And hopefully that's going to be for all of them. So we would key that in here. So this is the kind of stuff that COC admins are going to be required to have keyed in for each of the system, and the LSA is going to pull this information into it. And so to look at a project that's already been set up here, we can see what this might look like in the system. So here we have 10 beds. These initially started on 8/1/16. However, they got some more beds later on, and so there was an end date put on this for 6/1/18, and then a new record was created here starting 6/2/18 with 20 beds. So as they grew and changed, then a new record was created. And also both of these records related to households with at least one child and one adult and one child. But we can see here that from the beginning, they also had 10 beds that were just dedicated for households without children. So again, this is just what this might look like to your COC admins as it relates to your project. And next we have what you'll probably end up spending the most time on, and that is correcting data quality issues. But we have made new custom reports that allow you to target the specific data fields that we know are affecting the LSA, so you can easily and quickly identify what needs to be corrected. So I'm going to walk through those different reports, how they function, and how you can use them to help correct your data. So the first issue we're going to look at is relationship to head of household. So we know that anytime we do an enrollment with someone, it is set when we're selecting the project enrollment that they have relationship to head of household for each family member. And that is recorded on the program enrollment screen here. And this is where that's set. Now, because we have a lot of migrated data in the system, there were a lot of cases where everyone was marked as self, and then some cases where no one was marked as self. These are going to be things that cause a lot of problems for the LSA report, and so they will need to be corrected. So I mentioned we created these custom reports. You can find these from your home workspace, so make sure you are on your home workspace. You'll see a new menu group here called Custom Reports, and then under that is LSA Data Quality Reports. And these are the 5 reports that we have created. It is important that you correct these issues in a specific order because they kind of play into each other. You'll kind of understand that. That'll make more sense as we continue on in this training. But the first thing you want to look at is the head of household issues. And so you can click on this right here. This is going to pull up the report settings here. Now all of these reports, we've already set them where they pull all the projects under your agency that match the project types that the LSA is looking at, and it's looking at project enrollments that fall within that 9/30/15 to 9/30/18 time period. So you don't have to worry about setting any of that. The only thing you have to choose here is max rows. This just sets how many results we want back on this report. So the easiest thing to do here is just blank that out actually, so that you get all the results from this report when we run it. And then you can either click view results, which comes up with a window like so, where you can see your data. What I find usually more helpful is to get this into Excel. To do that, you can either click the Excel icon here and then click export, or if we'd wanted to, right off the bat, instead of clicking view results, we could just click on export, and this is going to allow us to save it as an Excel document. And I find that saving it in Excel is much more helpful than just having it as a viewable report within the system, because now I can go in and as I fix these, for instance, I could go in, highlight the ones I fixed. I've got a document I can kind of work from. I can sort it. I can do things like that. To be able to view all these columns a little easier, because we can see some of these are cut off, so I'm not able to see the enrollment dates here. I can't see all the program name. Easy way to do that is click this little area right here, which will highlight the whole sheet. Put your cursor between any 2 columns so you have those little double arrows, and then just double click and it'll go ahead and spread those out there. And now I'm going to just walk you through these results that we get here. So here we have a client ID, which of course is important, because if we're going to go in and fix this data, we need to know what client we need to pull up. So this client ID, we can just copy and paste that into the global search up here into client track, or we can do it in the find client. Let me get out of this workflow. If I'm under find client, I can paste it in there either way, and it's going to allow me to search for that client. Next, we have our program name, so we'll know, what's the exact program that enrollment we need to be looking for in the system. Next, we have case ID. So on a client's dashboard, you will see case IDs for enrollments they have. So that way, if they had multiple enrollments in the same project for the same day, which shouldn't happen, but because of data quality sometimes does, you'd be able to locate it by case ID. And then we have the count, and this is actually very important. This is kind of the key to this report, and this is what is letting you know there's a problem in the system with this enrollment. So what this is looking at is how many head of households there are for this enrollment. And we have this report set where it's only going to pull enrollments where there's a problem. So you're never going to see 1 here. You're either going to see 2 or greater, which lets you know there's multiple head of household. There's multiple members that are set as head of household. They're set as self. Or it's going to be totally blank, which means there's not a single person in this enrollment that is marked as being self, being marked as the head of household. And then finally we have the enroll date. So next I want to get into how would we go in and correct this. So we'll start with this first case here, and we can see that both of these have the same case ID, but different client IDs. So what that just is telling us is this is actually one enrollment, but because there's multiple head of households, the way this report will work is it will pull this in for each client. And so even though it's got different clients here, this is one enrollment that 2 clients are in. The good news here, though, is all we need to do is pull up one of these clients from this enrollment, and we'd be able to correct it, and it's going to take care of both of these lines here. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this, either one of these client IDs here. I'm going to go ahead and search for this client. We can see here the ID matches up, so that's the client I'm looking for. And then this person's only got one enrollment, so this is easy to locate, but we could always, based on our Excel sheet, look at the program name and then roll date to find the specific one we need to correct. And then what we want to do is click on View Case Members. And sure enough, we can see both of them are listed as self. So that should never be. Only one person should be listed as self. So what we need to do is change the person that is not the head of household to the relationship status that they need to have. Now, to get that information, to know who we need to change, you have a few options. One, if you have paper intakes that you keep or have another way of looking at what this should have been recorded as in the system, you can refer to that information. You can click on the household members section. You can look at age, and we can kind of figure it out from there a lot of times. So for instance, if Charlie's 32 and Mandy's only 4, we're going to say Mandy's probably not the head of household. She might like to think she's the head of household, but is not. So this would be probably needing to be a daughter. And also, and we can actually see here, she is listed as a daughter. So it's also important to remember that in Client Track, the household members setup, the way it's set as relationship head of household, is separate than the individual enrollments. And the reason that is it gives you the flexibility of when you are enrolling people, you might be presented with all of these household members when you go to a project intake, but you get to choose which ones you're enrolling and also which ones are reporting as head of household. So it kind of gives that flexibility in that, but then of course we also then have cases where sometimes the case members are incorrect and maybe the household members are correct while the household members are not correct. And the case members is actually what affects all of your compliance reporting. So this is what is going to pull in on things like the LSA and cause problems. And so we would always want to correct that from the View Case Members screen. So this would be as easy as selecting Mandy here, edit enrollment, and then instead of self, we will change her to daughter and click Save. Now this enrollment is not experiencing this issue. If we go back and run this report now, you're actually going to see both of those top 2 listings are gone now, right? Because we fixed this one, but it's the same case. So both of those would be correct now. So that's how you fix situations where they have multiple heads of household. Let's go to this next one here where they do not have a head of household. So we'll go ahead and just pull up this client. And then we'll look to see what project this was. So this is the Rapid Rehousing Project. And we'll do View Case Members. And sure enough, there's just one person in this enrollment and they're listed as son. So there's no one listed as self, and so that's going to be a problem. Now, you could just go in and edit the enrollment, choose self, but you're going to want to look at these at a case-by-case basis. So this is Tommy, and if I click on family members up here, I can see Tommy's only 9 years old. So Tommy probably does not need to be enrolled in a project by himself. This isn't a runaway homeless youth program. It's an SSVF rapid rehousing project. He's probably not a veteran either if he's only 9 years old. So there's some other things going on here. And so you'll have to look at these at a case-by-case basis on what you need to do, whether maybe the other family members needed to be enrolled in this, and you would need to use the edit enrollment workflow to add those additional family members. Maybe they were all enrolled initially, and the caseworker realized they shouldn't be enrolled, and they went in and deleted the enrollments for the other household members, which is a common thing that happens sometimes, but they didn't go in and delete the enrollment for the child. That's something we definitely see from time to time, and so what happens is it leaves someone orphaned in a enrollment by themselves with no head of household. To check that, for instance, I'm looking at these other family members. I can click enrollments and then view deleted items. And sure enough, they actually do have an enrollment in rapid rehousing, or they did have, that has been deleted. And we can see 12, 12, 16, so it's that same enrollment. So what happened here, it looks like, is the whole family was enrolled and everything was fine, and then they went in for whatever reason, deleted those the enrollment for the other two family members, which then left Tommy by himself. And so say we found out that actually this enrollment just needed to be deleted, then we could go ahead and do that, and then that would fix that problem. But again, you're just going to have to look at on a case-by-case basis to figure out what is going on. So like I said, because of migrated data, we have seen that there's potentially going to be a lot of cases like this where you're going to have to go in and correct these. The expectation is that all of these will be correct for this field. So for relationship to have household issues, you would want to get to the point where when you go and run that custom report, that it is coming back 0 results. And once we get to that point, only then would we want to continue with the next step I'm about to go over. So next we have client location. This is found in the Universal Data Assessment, and this is where you capture what COC you are serving the client in. And this is a really important field as it relates to the LSA, because as I mentioned, the LSA is just ran for your individual COC, and the way it pulls in enrollments is looking at the COC that's recorded under client location. So if you have enrollments that does not have client location recorded, then it will not pull in that enrollment period. So it's really important that we make sure all of our enrollments have client location recorded for them. So I'm going to go ahead and switch over to client track now, because this is a custom report we built in, so you can check for any cases where you have the client location missing. So I'm going to go ahead and clear out this so we can get all our results back, and we will export this into Excel. Now this query is looking for any head of households that are enrolled in projects for the LSA. And so the reason we had you go in first and correct all of those relationship head of household issues is that if you had multiple people marked as head of household, for instance, and those weren't corrected first, then this report would potentially pull all of those people in as needing client location filled out. But the true head of household is the only one that needs the client location filled out, and so that's why we want you to correct all those relationship to head of household issues first, and then go run this report so we can see who is really missing a client location and needs one. So I want to go ahead and expand this out, and we'll grab this first client here. We can see the program name, enroll date, and this is the entry assessment that is missing the client location. So we'll go ahead and pull up this client. We will locate the enrollment based on program name and enroll date. And what you're going to want to do is review entry assessments, because we know that's where that's missing. And again, that's found on the HMIS Universal Data Assessment. And sure enough, we can see client location is missing here. So we can go ahead and select that and click Save, and that would correct that issue. Something to be aware of, you might have some of these fields blank as well. If that was the case, each of these would need to be filled out before the form would allow you to click Save. If you don't have some of this information, you can use data not collected. Approximate date homelessness started would still be required. You can't leave that blank, and there's not an option to do data not collected. So if you don't have this date, if there's no way you can get this information, then this date would be the date previous to enrollment, because that's the only thing you could kind of vouch for to know that their homelessness started on that. You couldn't say that it started, a week ago, a month ago, if you don't have some kind of record of that. So just know, though, that it does have to have a date listed there. So going back to our list here, let's now look at this client. And for this record, it's the during program enrollment assessment where this is missing. And the assessment was done on 12/29/16. So we'll go ahead and pull up this client. And for this case, we would not want to do the review entry assessment, because that's not where this is missing. Actually, if we look on here, we'll see they do have the client location listed here, but it is the during program enrollment assessment where it's missing. If we click assessments over here, we'll be able to locate that during program enrollment assessment, and we can verify the date is the assessment we're looking for. We can click the action button here, click view related assessments, locate the HMS Universal Data, and then here we'd be able to go ahead and fill in the appropriate COC and click Save. So the two cases we just looked at here, they had assessment types listed in this column with an assessment date. This one's a little different here. This one does not have an assessment type listed or assessment date. So let's pull up this client and see what's going on here. And this is for the COC PSH on 4/12/18. So if we click the action button here, we don't have a review entry assessment button. And also, if we note over here, enroll assessment ID is totally blank. What this probably means is when this client was enrolled, the user just got through the enrollment screen. They did not continue through the workflow to create what we call a master assessment and a universal data assessment and all of the individual assessments that should go along with an enrollment. So the fix for this is a little different than the other ones. What we could do here is go through the edit enrollment workflow option. This is going to walk us through the intake workflow and allow us to fill in any information or complete assessments that were not done previous. So here we'll get to the universal data assessment page where we can fill in all this information, including the client location. And again, for some of these, you might have to use data not collected if you don't have a paper copy of this information or some other way to know what these should be filled out as. But in these cases, you would want to save this and actually continue through the workflow, which it'll bring up automatically, so that you can fill out the rest of these, even if you're having to use data not collected on some of those fields. And then once you were done with that, then you would be finished there. And again, this, just like relationship data of household, would be something that the expectation would be that all of these issues would be fixed so that every enrollment, every during program enrollment assessment would have a client location, and that you would get to a point where when you go and run this report, that is bringing back 0 results. And once you get to that point, we will be able to continue on. Next we have move-in dates. So we know that all permanent supportive housing projects and rapid rehousing projects have both a project start date when a client is enrolled in a project, but then they also have a move-in date that needs to be recorded for when they actually move into housing. This field becomes really important in regards to the LSA because it looks to this field to help calculate the length of time homeless that a client has and look at when they actually received housing, not just when they moved in or were enrolled into a project. So we want to make sure anyone that did move into housing and needs a move-in date has that in the system. And this is one of the other custom reports we put together so you can easily pull this information. So I'm going to go ahead and get this in Excel so we can look at this data. Now the way this report works is it is just looking at any enrollments that the LSA would pull in that does not have a move-in date. This doesn't necessarily mean all of these people need move-in dates because we don't know who moved into housing or who didn't move into housing. All we can provide you is enrollments where there's not a move-in date, and then it will be up to you to look through those and identify cases where they did move in. We did, however, add some columns here that we think will help you identify some cases where it's more likely that they need a move-in date. So we have kind of our standard columns here: program name, enroll date, exit date. Here we did a calculation where for people that exited, you can see how many days they were enrolled in the project. So what you can do with this is you can sort it, and then we can look at this and look at people that stayed in the project for a long time, because we know if someone stayed in a project for 326 days, for instance, they probably moved into housing, right? They probably weren't just enrolled in a rapid rehousing project that entire time and did not end up getting housing. So you can kind of use this, and then basing it on how your project operates, you can identify cases where you'll probably need to go in and add a housing move-in date, and hopefully you have that recorded somewhere where you'll be able to know what that move-in date is. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up one of these clients here, and you'll see here on the dashboard housing move-in date is blank. There's no housing move-in date. Now for someone that's already been exited and we need to add housing move-in date, kind of a shortcut to get to that screen is using the missed annual/update assessment button. Now normally this is used to record an annual assessment that was missed, that you didn't record before you exited somebody, but we can use it to quickly get to that enrollment screen where we can then go in and record that housing move-in date. So let's say for this case they were enrolled on 3/2/16 and maybe they got housing a month later, so we can go ahead and record that and click save. Now it's going to want to continue through this workflow process in recording and either an update or an annual assessment. We don't need to do that. We were just using the button to be able to add that move-in date so we can safely cancel out of this workflow. So let's go back to our spreadsheet here, and that was someone that had already been exited. These are people without exit dates, so these are people that are still currently enrolled in the project. And what you can do here is sort this so that it's looking at the oldest to newest, and we can actually see it sorted this way here. And we can see this person, they were enrolled not too long ago, so it might be that they have not received housing yet, and it's okay that they're showing up on this report because they don't have a move-in date. But if we look at the case here, they were enrolled a couple years ago and they're still enrolled, so they probably, hopefully, got housed and that move-in date was just not on there. So what we can do there is pull up the client. We'll see, yep, they don't have a housing move-in date. For these, we're not going to have the button there, the missed annual assessment, because they are still currently enrolled. What we can do here though is just go through the edit enrollment workflow. We'll skip the first few pages. We'll get to that enrollment screen, and then here we can go ahead and add that housing move-in date, whatever that needs to be. We can then click save. And then once that's saved, we don't need to continue through the workflow. Unless in this case, we actually have missing information, we would fill that out. But once we've recorded what we need to, we could go ahead and cancel that workflow, and that housing move-in date is going to be recorded as such. Something to keep in mind on this, just some kind of pointers as you're working through data. You might have some really old enrollments that don't have housing move-in date. If you have any permanent supportive housing enrollments that are before the project start date is before October 1st, 2017, the move-in date for those would just be October 1st, 2000, or no, excuse me, the move-in date for those would be whatever the project start date is. So again, for any project start dates for permanent supportive housing that happened before October 1st, 2017, the move-in date would be the same date as the project start date, because before October 1st, 2017, permanent supportive housing projects were not required to record a move-in date, so the project start date and move-in date would be the same. So that makes those very easy to correct. And then also just a reminder on rapid rehousing projects, the move-in date should reflect the date they get housing, even if it is housing that's not provided by that particular project. That's different than permanent supportive housing. So for permanent supportive housing, if they are enrolled in permanent supportive housing and they end up not moving into that permanent supportive housing project, but they get housed somewhere else that's permanent, you would just go ahead and exit them from the enrollment with the correct permanent destination recorded. But again, on rapid rehousing projects, if you are enrolling them, you're still providing, just supportive services only, and they end up going somewhere else. Maybe they just get their own place on their own, a rental. You would still go ahead and record a move-in date for when that happens. So just something to keep in mind there. And then finally we get to just general data quality cleanup. And so that includes the other things that are captured while enrolling and exiting clients, such as personal identifiable information, enrollment, exit dates, and destination. And then particularly the universal data assessment as well as the domestic violence assessment. And we did create a couple of custom reports here that look at particular pieces of that. One of those is the LSA 3.917. 3.917 is kind of a fancy way of referring to the living situation questions that are found on the universal data assessment. So those are the questions where it asks, where did the client stay the night before? How long have they been homeless? When was their homeless start date? How many times have they been homeless in the past 3 years? That kind of thing. And those become very important questions for the LSA because it's part of the data the LSA looks at to help determine a client's length of time homeless, if they're chronically homeless, things like that. So if we are able to correct any data that is quote-unquote missing, it will help show a better picture of our clients in that regard. Now, that being said, we do not expect that either two of these reports get to a place where they come back without any issues, where you run these and there's no results, because these reports look at cases where you might have data not collected for one of the questions, you might have client refused, you might have client doesn't know, and we know that sometimes those are appropriate answers, right? If the client doesn't know a question, then sometimes we have to record it as client doesn't know, or if they refuse it. Sometimes, unfortunately, the data just was not collected, so we have to use data not collected. So I wanted to just make that point because what we don't want to happen is we don't want you to ever go in and assume information or make up information just so a data quality report looks better. And so while we said on household issues and client locations, those should be all corrected because that should be information you're able to figure out and key into the system so that they come back totally clean. We know that that's not going to always be the case on situations where it's involving like the universal data assessment. So that being said, let's go ahead and go in and run this report, and we'll be able to kind of see what it looks like, what it's looking at, and how we can go correct any data that we are able to. So here's our report here. Let's look at this first case here. We can see some of these questions do have answers, but the continuously homeless months, which is this on the universal data assessment, is how many months the client was continuously homeless. We can see that shows data not collected. So we could pull up this client record here. Click the action button beside the enrollment, click review entry assessments. And again, it's going to be on that HMIS Universal Data Assessment. And so here we can see all those questions, and sure enough for this one, data not collected is marked down there. Now if that's the case, if we don't know that information, we would leave it at that. But if you did have this information, say you had it on a paper intake form, you could go in and choose the appropriate answer and then click save. And so we can kind of go down this list and we can kind of see where things are missing. Here's where a client doesn't know is for the length of stay or client refused. So again, as we have any of this information and correct any of this, we would want to go ahead and do that. This one here is a little different. This one doesn't have anything filled out here, and so this would be something we'd want to probably look at. So let's go ahead and pull up this client. And again, go to our review entry assessments, universal data. And we can see here, these aren't filled out at all. So if we've got that information, we can fill it out. If we don't, we could do data not collected, and we do that on all of these here. This one down here is even a little different than that because there's not even an assessment date that's listed here. So let's pull up this client, see what it looks like. And this is for the ESG shelter enrollment 12/12/16. And here's a case where it looks like the user did not go all the way through the workflow when they enrolled the client. So we don't even have the review entry assessment option, kind of like we talked about earlier in this video. And you'll note the enroll assessment ID is not even there. So in those cases, to add those add information like the universal data assessment, we would have to go through the edit enrollment workflow, which of course will walk you through capturing all that, and we just would go all the way through that workflow and fill in any information that we can. So that kind of covers the 3.917 report and how you can use that to help you with data quality. Then of course the other one, custom report we had here, was the missing domestic violence. So let's go ahead and export this. And what this report is going to look at is going to look at either people where they didn't get the domestic violence assessment at all, and they should have. Maybe they have some don't knows for domestic violence experienced. Or maybe they have yes for domestic violence experienced, but the currently fleeing question is not filled out. Because in HMIS, if you have yes for domestic violence experience, then it's required to have currently fleeing. So it'll look at all of those situations and pull in any where the information is not there. So let's just go ahead and pull in this client. And this is for the transitional enrollment. And again, we would just do review entry assessments. We can see, yep, that domestic violence assessment was not completed, so we would just fill in that information and click save. This one is missing it on the during program enrollment assessment, so we would pull up this client, go over to assessments. There's our during program enrollment assessment. Click review related assessments and add our domestic violence information there if we have it, or data not collected if it's not available. So that kind of covers the different things that we were really asking you to look at and the tools that we created to help you to do that. I wasn't able to really go over every potential scenario you might run into in regards to correcting those different pieces. So you might run into situations, especially with migrated data, where it's kind of tricky getting that corrected, or you run into a particular error message. As always, you can always submit a issue ticket on those cases, and we will be glad to help you, either a COC admin or us, one of your system admins. So another thing I wanted to mention is that all of the custom reports we just went over, those were also made available to your system, your COC admins, in a way that they can run them for your entire COC. And so what they're going to be doing is they're going to be running those as well. And then the idea is that they would then work with you and let you know things that need to be corrected. But we went ahead and created these for you as well, so you can go ahead and be ahead of the game and start running these and correcting data on your own. So that way, when they do kind of like a final run through and are running those, hopefully all this information will already be corrected, but they will be another set of eyes that are looking at it as well. So as y'all work together, hopefully we can get any data cleaned up that we can. So that concludes this video. Hopefully it's been instructional, and we are looking forward to a successful LSA submission for each of your COCs.